My opinions of unions have evolved since doing research on this over the past week. And I think they operate less like an organized labor designed to negotiate with a big business and more like a separate political institution, like an agency that receives like tax revenue to spend to advance, legislative, political, and like social agendas. What do you think? Just like knee jerk reaction about unions. What is it?
Like the Teamsters, the Irishman movie. Just deep organized. Like talk about a political organization, extremely powerful and pretty brutal. Now, that's a movie.
I'm thinking about doing something a little bit different in the sense we only get to talk to each other once a week, but like so much happens over the week that, that is worthy of, I think, coverage on this program. I think it's kind of a shame that we just have to toss it all aside. Remember when we first started this, there was a concern that we would have struggled to come up with topics, and that turned out to totally not be true. Yeah. I think it's the opposite. There's like too much to cover. So the first one I wanted to touch upon is that spike in the 30-year bond yields over in Japan. This has to do with a follow-up to episode 68. That was one of your episodes in which we talked about how the yen continues to fall despite an increase in rates. You remember all that? And, we talked about the new PM's maximum growth plan. And then you said, like, some things to look out for.
Really, it's the interest rates that are going to be one of the core things to watch as all of this gets going. Auction sizes of JGBs are going to increase. That's a fact. That's how this is going to be paid for. The next thing I always watch is how much more, if any, are interest rates increasing due to these larger auction sizes. That's kind of like the first, very on the ground, very specific view of how's the market responding to these new plans.
Little bit of a spike recently. And I know you were texting me.
That's
I think
right.
The words you used were insane and troubling, like 30 basis point spike. I think it's attributed to the Japanese PM proposing to cut the sales tax on food, I guess, to like 0%. It is 8% now for 2 years, but there was no sort of offsetting revenue for the government. They sold off a bunch of the bonds and that drove the yield up. There's going to be a snap election now in Japan scheduled for February 8th. I had to give myself something of a Japanese civics lesson because obviously I don't know what that is. But basically, the PM is the head of government and it's elected by these two houses. There's the House of Representatives. It's got a couple hundred seats. Then it's got the House of Councilors. And the thing is, and this is something that's totally new to like the US brain, is the fact that the PM can at any time dissolve the House of Representatives. They can just be like, you guys are all kicked out and then hold another set of elections. And that's what this like February 8th thing is. And it's just to ask the public essentially of, do you approve of these policies? Like, do you approve the direction of the government is headed? And so now we're going to find out what happens on February 8th. So that's pretty exciting. But I know you follow this a lot more than I do. So anything you want to talk about or add?
On the same day, I don't know the exact order of events, but it was both things. Like there was a 20-year bond auction that day, which was really weak. So there wasn't as many people as they thought that were coming to bid on it. So the price had to go down. That was pushing yields up as well. So the 30 and 40-year bonds, the long end, those yields increased by like 30 basis points in that single day. And this is in a bond market where 1 or 2 basis points used to be seen as a lot, like only about 2 or 3 years ago. Really, it was the least volatile government bond market for many, many years. Like, it was seen as like the one place where you could count on things not being volatile, just because the Bank of Japan pretty much has had such an iron grip on its yield curve for like this post deflation period for so many years. There's actually an entire trade called the Widowmaker that apparently has like destroyed people's careers, because taking the bet that Japanese yields have to rise. You look at all the pieces put together like this over the decades, the yields are way too low. Sell the yields. And the Bank of Japan says, nope, sorry, you're not going to do, they're not going anywhere. And so people make big bets, they lose a ton of money. And, yeah, so this is like a really kind of turning the tide moment. Not only is it very similar to what we saw in the UK. It's particularly interesting that it's happening in Japan, given all of that history. So we're like truly leaving this decades-long regime where yields were so low. And actually, one of the other kind of interesting pieces too is that the Japanese yield curve is now higher than the Chinese yield curve. You see kind of an inversion happening right now in that for the longest time, Japanese yields that were too low. It was tough to get economic activity. Inflation was too low. It was a savers environment, and you're seeing the same thing in China right now too. You're seeing declining economic growth, deflationary. Like I think there's 6 or 7 consecutive quarters of deflation, so now the Chinese yield curve is now getting closer and closer to zero. Last thing I'll say is that this week, what also made it interesting, kind of anecdotal, but there was another follow-up story on Bloomberg saying that just about all of that huge, it was like 27 basis point move in the 40-year bond was due to like $180 million transaction. Like a really, really tiny amount. This is a bond market that's, I think the Japanese bond market is like $7 trillion. So this was like a couple of sell orders for like 170 or 180 million, not billion, $1 million. So like just a tiny, tiny amount. And that's kind of makes the whole story even, a little crazier too, because it's that fragile. That's all it took. There was just no buyers.
I was just going to say, it might just not be a very deep market.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's not a deep market, and that's how these things happen. But that interest rate, that's what the government pays. So even if like deep market or not, if yields move that much, that's a huge impact on the entire country. Now, those prices did come back in a couple days after because it was so sharp, but the yields are still higher today than they were before this week began. So the trend is still going, but just the degree to which how sharp it was and how fragile it was really notable.
That guy, Andrew Ross Sorkin, you know who that is? He came out with a book, 1929.
Too Big to Fail.
Not too long ago. He came out with Too Big to Fail. That was the big one. Here's his latest book, 1929. Just finished it a day or two ago. Ooh, what do you mean?
Oh, it's just, that's quite a brick. It looks like.
Yeah, it's not too bad. In fact, there's some pretty big text. It's trying to be a lot more than it really is. And, so first off, I'd say, yeah, I recommend it. I finished it, which means I have to recommend it. I personally have no qualms with just putting a book down. That's not interesting to me. So the fact that I finished it is it's enough of a recommendation. The other thing is I was kind of surprised when it ended because I don't know if you know this, but the end is around here, there's still a good chunk of book left. It's because there's a really long epilogue and an afterword and a bunch of notes. So I was surprised and a little disappointed when I realized that was at the end of the book. I would categorize it as a popular finance book. Do you know what I mean by that? There's popular science books, the Malcolm Gladwell books, where if someone's trying to teach you the general and special theory of relativity, imagine you're on a train and you're moving down and it's not really all that tough. And there's popular biography books. I think Walter Isaacson is, he writes popular biographies. He doesn't write serious biographies. He's not a Ron Chernow or a Ian Swafford. Those are serious. Those are the huge tomes. Those are the 1,000-page George Washington books. You seen those?
What's the difference? They're just longer and more in depth?
Basically. I mean, in short, they're just way longer, way more in depth. So what that means, it's a much lighter read. It's intended for the mass market. Anyone can kind of pick it up and understand it. The focus is more on the people and the moments and the drama and less on yields up, prices down, and sort of the nitty gritty of finance and numbers and stuff. But I think that also gives kind of a benefit in a way, if you want to remember sort of what happened, what caused the 1929 stock market boom and then bust. It's you could read a textbook and it's super dry, or you could try to look at, you know, the people at the time who were actually making the decisions and what they were weighing and how things worked. And imagine yourself going up to a broker and then being like, you know, taking out a margin loan. And you can read about quote unquote margin loans, or you could say, hey, Joe, I'm a broker and I'm going to go ahead and say, you give me $1,000. I'm going to buy $1,000 worth of stock. And then I'm going to give you a loan of $9,000, and you're going to put up that $1,000 of stock up as collateral, and you're going to put that $9,000 into the same stock.
Oh yeah, lever up.
That's it, right? And so, like, when you start imagining and start doing that, now all of a sudden, if the stock goes up like 10% or whatever, you've just like doubled, you know, your equity. Like that's the beauty of finance. And it, you know, again, it's one thing to kind of like read about leverage and stuff. It's another to sort of imagine yourself at the brokerage dealer. And that's what I think Sorkin does. And I think he does it pretty well. The main characters in there, you know, Thomas Lamont, you know, the partner at JP Morgan, you got the presidents, Hoover and Roosevelt, you got Charles Mitchell, you got Senator Glass, who wrote partly wrote the Glass-Steagall bill, and all like the different personalities pulling at the different threads of like what should and, you know, what the finance, industry should and should not look like. Very closely researched. I really appreciate the little details. Like he like read all of Lamont's journal entries and described like what he was reading on like what days and stuff like that. You don't have to include that stuff, but it's nice just to kind of give you a sense of these people. Yeah. I guess my favorite parts were kind of the legal case at the end against Charles Mitchell. He was the head of City National Bank. What he did was he sold a whole bunch of City National Bank, like his own bank stock, to his wife at a big loss, so he could take a big loss, for his tax returns, and he didn't have to pay any income taxes.
Pretty slick.
I won't give away. Yeah, that was pretty common on Wall Street, and I won't let you know if they found him guilty or not. But that was an interesting saga. How like Rockefeller and sort of rivals to the House of Morgan were able to get their fingers into actually writing the Glass-Steagall Act. So this was also kind of interesting because the Glass-Steagall Act, the big thing it did was it split up the commercial banking from the investment banking. So the big thing that drove up the 1929 crash had to do with like commercial banks and all the power, all the credit that was available from like the huge deposit base was able to just funnel into the investment bank side. And that's it's just a credit fueled bubble. I mean, it's insane.
Just and everybody's savings and deposits.
Imagine everyone's savings just getting shoved into the stock market because people would just do what I described earlier. They lever up and they were just like make insane amounts of just paper money, just, you know, and
if everybody's doing it and it's worked for years, you know, it's like a bad move not to.
Exactly. That's what happened
at that point, or so it seems.
So the interesting thing were like Glass, he originally, when he was looking to draft the legislation, all he wanted to do was to split up the commercial and the investment side of public institutions. JP Morgan was famously a partnership. It is a private company. And so what, you know, some of sort of an interesting bit of history is how people who sort of viewed the House of Morgan as their rival were able to sort of get in and start drafting legislation and said, no, actually all banks need to split up the kind of commercial and the investment side. So that would include like the House of Morgan. And that's ended up ultimately what happened. I guess less than great. I wish there were a lot more details in there about the Fed. The Fed was in there sort of at the beginning, and there were some interesting stories around Mitchell and the Fed. But then after that, the book is sort of split up into two halves. One is sort of the lead up to the crash, like the year 1929 is the first part of the book. And then the second part of the book is like maybe 5 years or something after that. And there's a little bit of the Fed at the first half. There's very little Fed at all afterwards. I'd be really curious to kind of learn more about the personalities and stuff there. The other thing is Sorkin definitely that I thought like could have been better was just the prose. I mean, Sorkin is, this book isn't going to win any like awards in writing, even though it's clear that he tried. He tried to make really beautiful, descriptive, language and put you in the scene. But I had just read not too long ago Rules of Civility by Amor Towles, who's like a proper, he's like a fiction writer. He's just like very strong with the prose, and reading those two, just juxtaposing those two books, you can just see clearly that Sorkin is not a literary powerhouse, but I appreciate him trying. Overall I'd give it a B+. Now that we're getting into, I guess, book reviews here.
Did that just come out?
Yeah, it just came out. Maybe like December, something like that. I got it for Christmas. My mom got it for Christmas for me.
Oh, nice.
Thanks, Mom. Shout out.
It just makes me want to read it because now that you mention it, I realize how little I really know about the whole thing. But you said the second half was like 5 years after 1929.
Yeah,
it's
not a snapshot of 5 years. It just kind of happens over 5 years. So the way it works is each chapter starts with a date of like something happening.
Okay.
And like the first part is just starts in 1929. They start describing some places where the market was getting kind of wobbly. And even Mitchell, really interesting part had to do when Mitchell, who was, I guess, on the board at the Fed, and the Fed had come out with a policy that said, Fed credit is no longer going to be used for brokers for like speculation. No more of this, overnight speculative loans. And suddenly like rates spiked to like 20%. And then Mitchell himself, and he sort of ordered on behalf of Wall Street in general, allocated a bunch of credit from his own bank to sort of steady the market. And sure enough, rates came way down. But at the same time, he's like on the board at the Fed and then taking like action that goes directly against what they were advising. And so Glass, this like super pissed off Glass and like some other people at the Fed and stuff like that. Really, the only reason Mitchell was on the board was just to kind of help, just so that Mitchell would stop criticizing the Fed so much.
Yes, and then like in that second part, like does it go like what's the focus then? Is it on, I guess, the start of the Great Depression and like the response to it?
Yeah. A lot of focus then on the policy responses from Hoover and Roosevelt, the construction of the Glass-Steagall Act, which came out afterwards, the fallout, the trials against like Mitchell and some of the other big names. The other thing that's kind of interesting is it didn't happen on one. This is not something I really appreciated either, but the Depression didn't start on one day at the end of 1929. It just kind of was a slow bleed for like a year.
Yeah.
So like the market was like still going down into like 1930.
Mm-hmm.
There's like one dramatic day, which they describe, again, this is one of the places he tries to kind of flex his literary muscles a little bit, like the actual day of the panic. But it was just a slow bleed throughout like 1930. So another big thing that came out of Glass-Steagall, or like the 1929, was the FDIC insurance. So then like there's this whole, you start getting into philosophical discussions around, what should the government do and not do. So right, afterwards, when the FDIC came about, depositors had insurance. This is the other thing that sort of interested me that I didn't really understand or appreciate, was just how a depression sort of just kind of goes on for so long, if that makes sense. And they did a good job of it describing like how that would happen. Basically, banks were there were like 10,000 or something banks failed, just like an ungodly amount of numbers. Like they were so fractured, they're all over the place. And people stopped trusting banks. They would just take out and put their cash literally under the mattress.
Yeah.
And when that happens, now all of a sudden banks don't even have like the horsepower to issue credit, which is just so much what drives consumptions and stuff like that.
Right.
So now all of a sudden that huge malaise just sets in. Interesting how Hoover coined the term depression. And it was like one of his biggest political blunders, because he was like, this isn't a panic, it's more like a depression. And that just, panics end quickly. Depression's like, this could go on forever.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Hoover had some missteps.
Yeah, and like just how those things like it becomes psychological as well. And it took, World War II to end that thing. Like change the entire world and then some. You just had to wipe everything and start over again.
That's 1929. Pick up a copy if you like.
Sounds like a good read.
That's pretty good. Yeah. The other kind of honorable mentions for this week, I guess we saw headlines. JP Morgan buys up the Apple credit card from Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs, they've been just selling off, divesting their consumer segment for like a couple of years now. That's kind of interesting. We're not going to talk about that. Another bill got passed to avoid a government shutdown. There was sort of some question marks about that, certainly at the end of last month, kind of going into this month, if the end of January there'd be another shutdown. But sounds like that was averted. And then finally, I listened to the interview of our boy Scotty B at Davos. That was really interesting. He touched upon a lot of stuff that we would love to dig into, including like the housing market stuff. I got to say, after listening to the interview, I really like him. He's like really starting to grow on me.
Oh yeah,
Scotty B. Yeah,
It's like you can tell he's had a long career in the field, so he really gets it. Like, not only does he understand, how everything works, but I think he's got a really sharp eye for things that do and don't matter. I think it'd be easy to say he criticizes the Fed because Trump criticizes the Fed, but I also think that he's got a point. His line recently, or I think he said it a bunch of times now, that the Fed is UBI for economics PhDs.
All these PhDs over there, I don't know what they do. This is like universal basic income for academic economists.
Mr. Secretary, we had Elizabeth Warren on last week, and we asked...
What do you mean UBI? Universal basic income?
Yeah, exactly. Just give the economists something to do.
I didn't get that. Okay. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
When it's like, it's like you can have
like artificial demand for economic PhDs.
Yeah, and then like at the end of the day, he's in Besant's position, he's just kind of looking past all this stuff. He's like, what are we really doing here? Like, what's the Fed doing? The Fed has become too complicated. I don't care about all this stuff. We need to make some changes. And he's also does a really good job of not attacking people, but certainly being very aggressive. Like, really, like, he's got a certain brand and it fits with Trump's style. Like, to be in Trump's circle, you have to be that way.
Now,
yeah, he's good.
With the appetizer done, let's get into the main course. So the main thing I wanted to talk to you about was the billionaire tax bill. But first, I want to give you my baggage. So I do have a little bit of union experience. So I was at Columbia as a graduate student from 2016 to 2018. And I did a TA, so I was a teaching assistant during my second year, so semesters 3 and 4. And I taught macroeconomics and accounting. Now, in 2016, this is sort of the key thing, the National Labor Relations Board, this is a U.S. federal agency that enforces the National Labor Relations Act. They came out and flipped a 2004 decision about graduate students. And they said that graduate students, were no longer primarily students, but they were also employees. And if you became employees, then you could unionize. So that's when the gears started turning. And Columbia, as you know, in the heart of New York, is super progressive. So when they heard that there was a chance to unionize, it's kind of the loudest voices were all just for the phrase. They were just all for it. No one had to convince anyone anything. Okay. They heard the phrase like workers' rights, and then people at Columbia just like went blind and just started waving placards. Like, there was no contest. Mm-hmm. But now, if it isn't obvious, I'm just generally skeptical by nature. I see a bandwagon, I turn around and I run the other way. There was a couple instances where like I was teaching my class as a TA, and then there were like other TAs from other colleges that were like waiting for me outside the class, and that was like getting pressured to like sign stuff. And I just generally resisted. Other students were like coming to me and they wanted to get me to like kind of be more involved in the union stuff. And I was like, okay, let me sit down and think about it.
I got homework to do. Leave me alone.
Yeah. I got your, freaking homework.
I got to grade your,
okay. I got to grade your papers. And oh man, that's definitely the worst part. It's like grading tests. So I sat down and I thought about it, and I kind of formed a general opinion about, if not unions more broadly, certainly that specific instance of Columbia trying to unionize. Now, just for the record, so I was at SEPA. The provost and the dean were strongly against unionization, and they fought it tooth and nail, and every like angle they could. Like there were elections, and I remember they started kind of attacking whether or not the elections were valid because they had like union members near the where people were voting, and that could have been seen as like not a fair election and stuff like that. They went after it however they could. They did not want them to unionize. For me personally, I was also against it. And let me tell you how I got here. The first thing that bothered me was the fact that we were going to be represented by the United Auto Workers, which always I was just like, WTF, can we choose what union? Like they were like assigning us a union. The other thing was like no one from the unions ever showed up. So they talk about at campus to like kind of try to sell their union. I don't know if they like weren't allowed to or something, but it always kind of struck me as odd by like people would ask me to join it, and I'm like, where are they? Like, who are these people? It's just like, how about you just give me a face or something?
Yeah.
That said, though, they did organize I don't know who they were, but there were organized gatherings sort of to promote and discuss the unionization efforts. I think one of them was held at the Broadway Presbyterian Church. I remember it was just right across Broadway, I think, at like a church. And we went in and sat down, and they had a little agenda where they had people get up to kind of talk about why we should unionize. And there was a little panel of people, and there's some pretty heavyweights there. I think there was like our local like Congress men and women were there. Like there were some pretty heavy hitters at the table, all sort of pushing us to saying why it was such a great idea to unionize. And I got to say, I was definitely not convinced that we should unionize after listening to them. I'll give you a couple of the arguments, okay? And you can tell me. One guy, I remember, he was like a research science at one of the colleges, right? And the reason why he thought we should unionize was he thought it was very annoying and inconvenient that he had to use bottled water for his experiments, and he couldn't use the tap water because it like wasn't pure enough. It was like, that's one of the reasons. It's like, look, yeah, the building's old, man. I don't, another guy, God, I remember this one. He like came out and he thought the air wasn't good enough. And he like came out and like showed an air filter, and he had this like really serious look on his face. And like, he's holding up this air filter, and it's like kind of a little gray. And like, it's kind of like this. And it's like quiet in there. And I'm like, are you fucking serious? This is what we're talking about? So, around that time, I read the book Oil by Upton Sinclair, which describes like the California, oil rush and people going there. And this was like 1920s and stuff. And, unions were sort of taken off then. At that era, like when unions started to get hold, the reason why was because like a mine would collapse and 20 men would die, and then their families would be left with nothing. Like they were working, 12-hour shifts. They were getting, seriously harmed. Okay, then you can convince me that, you should probably, maybe unionization is a good thing. But I mean, just for some perspective here, like this is in the back of my mind, like, tens of people dead. And this guy is annoyed that he has to use bottled water. It's like, man, I was like embarrassed for my generation sitting in, I mean,
different set of problems.
I was not, seriously, I was not convinced by any means. If anything, I went the other way after listening to them. Another big reason that I was against it had to do with, there are multiple colleges at a university, like multiple grad schools, and they each had their own policy on how they should do TAs. And SEPA had a really great policy. Like SEPA TAs got paid. It was effectively a scholarship. They didn't say it as much, but it effectively worked as a scholarship. They were getting like TAs for one semester was like $20,000.
Wow.
It's a lot. And it just goes to paying down your tuition. Now, other colleges, it was like $7,000, which is still pretty good. But like a big question I had, and which was never answered, would be like, if we get this other thing, the UAW to represent us, and they go into negotiations, and then they just say the price for everyone is going to be $10,000, they could call that as a big win, because most colleges would come out with a big a big raise. Whereas, the SEPA would get totally crushed. It's like, what's happening here? What's stopping that situation from happening? That was like a real scenario. And I was like, can we just kind of hold off and talk about this for a second? Another reason is that I really didn't like the idea of a third party, like forcing to talk to, or work out stuff with my professor, effectively my boss, through a third party. I mean, everyone at that university and that college is like super nice. Okay. Like I at least, in my experience, the two that I worked for, they're great. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything better. If you could imagine that they would insert some other person, some other institutional organization in between us, and so that we had to go talk through this, or like we couldn't do certain things, totally against that as well. And like, would that be the case? We didn't know, but all these questions I had in my mind, and yet people are out there like just, with the with the placards, stopping people from getting into class. I think even at one point, like I remember walking through a couple lines, head down, just like. So anyway, man, and then the final reason is the fact that they start, and you touched upon this earlier, is they just start siphoning off your paycheck. I think it's like 1%, which isn't a lot. Okay.
Right.
But I think at the
university,
university,
don't worry about it.
I think the provost, like I wouldn't really notice that. It'd be like 200. I mean, it'd be like $200. But at the university level, I think the estimation was like $1 million that they were going to be getting out of Columbia, from all of the grad students and all of their paychecks. And that I really didn't like. So that's my experience. And then I graduated, and I think the fight kept going on, and I stopped following it.
I mean, I guess what's most striking is that contrast with 100 years ago and the problems a union would address then versus the problems they presumably address now. It's like, it's laughable in comparison. It's like, it's not even a problem at all.
Yeah. Yeah, man, people were built differently 100 years ago. They really were. So next chapter here, union economics, just real quick. So I guess the stated goal to improve workers' conditions, in my estimation, I think it's to maximize the ratio of money earned per unit work. And so you could deal with sort of the numerator denominator there. You could like try to get the maximum wage at the same time try to get the minimum amount of work. I kind of came to that conclusion during COVID, and like with the teachers unions seemed to be just, in my read, 100% working against working. I don't know. That had a big impact on me. Please. Just watching that whole thing.
They felt unsafe.
Yeah. So that left an impression. So like in a state of, let's say like California, for instance, there isn't just like one union. There are several of them, a bunch of them. Some of the bigger ones, the California Teachers Association is a big one. The Service Employees International Union, SEIU, is one, and they also have separate like chapters. And I think even sometimes they split because they disagree on sort of the direction of it. And each of them has, can have like 100,000 members or so, several 100,000. I think like California has like 16% of people working are unionized, and that varies greatly depending on what industry. So like education and healthcare, much higher percentage than like finance, for example, or tech. Now the unions, they would gather, they gather fees. They gather essentially what I'm going to call a tax on the paycheck of their union members at some small amount. And they think collectively, I sort of asked Grok this, I was wondering like how much dry powder they have to work with. I think it's about $1 billion across all the unions, roughly, a year. That's quite powerful if you wanted to put that towards their political goals. Just to describe the tactics maybe of how things might work is part of this like legislative, what could be called by the critics legislative blackmail almost, where basically one instance has to do with the SEIU UHW. They would sponsor sort of major statewide ballot initiatives in California's sort of targeting specific companies, essentially. there was a big saga with the dialysis clinics. I don't know if you know what dialysis is, but it's like if your kidneys break down and you got to like swap out the blood. That's like dialysis. And that there were like two big ones that dominated the market in California. And I guess the unions decided they were going to go after them. So they start putting up propositions, like limiting the clinic's revenue, clinic requirements. I think a big one was, when you're undergoing dialysis, you had to have like a doctor or a nurse present, kind of stuff like that. They wanted to change the rules around that. All of them failed. But the interesting thing is, the amount of money that these other companies had to spend in order to put it down was like 10x the amount of money that the union spent to put it down. So even just the fact that you had to fight this is sort of a victory in itself for the unions. So that's sort of one of the tactics. And that's sort of the transition in this Billionaire Tax Act. It's just less obvious to me who exactly, if anyone, they're going after. But before I get to that, when I was sort of reading about this, a couple of things occurred to me that I thought were quite shocking. One was the fact that the unions they're drafting up their own legislation. Like when you talk about the Billionaire Tax Act, you think it's just an idea, or at least I did. No, it's like a 30-page legal document. Like it's clearly written to be like a law, and it's written by them. So it's just strange to me that they're sort of acting like a legislature. And so that sort of breaks this connection I had about unions being, okay, this is someone who represents a bunch of workers across the table from like, the head of a business. No, they're putting in laws for the state to change the legislature. The other thing that's I think kind of nuts is the fact that not only is it like legislation for, these propositions about the dialysis companies saying that, okay, they had to, legally have a nurse or something present or whatever. That's like one thing. The Billionaire Tax Act is fiscal policy. I mean, they are now writing fiscal policy for the state. Like, stay in your lane. Like, what is this? It's like they decided that there isn't going to be enough money to fund these programs. So we're going to go ahead and come up with a tax. I think that's pretty crazy if you think about it.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit behind the times here, actually. Did this legislation just come out this week, or has this been around for a little while?
Sorry, it's a proposition. You can see that it was addressed to Attorney General Rob Bonta, Office of Attorney General in Sacramento, California. And it says, pursuant to Elections Code Section 9002B, enclosed, please find an amendment to initiative number whatever, also known as the 2026 Billionaire Tax Act. And it's truly signed by a woman named Suzanne Jimenez. Now, I looked her up. She is the chief of staff of the SEIU UHW, so the Service Employees International Union Healthcare Workers West. One thing that stands out to me is even just that term, chief of staff, kind of is reminiscent of like there's a president. But then it comes and you can just see there's like Section 1 title. It reads just like an act. It starts talking about the findings, Section 2. So the very first one says they decide to give the justification for the tax. And it reads, the people recognize that access to adequate health care, quality public education, and nourishing food is essential to human dignity and to the prosperity and resilience of the entire state. The cascading impacts of looming federal funding cuts for healthcare, education, and food programs now threaten these foundations and place the welfare of all Californians at risk. So that's sort of, the justification is the sense, all right, well, if you, Trump, the administration, is going to cut funding, we're going to tax your billionaires. I mean, that's basically, that's my read.
Yeah. I mean, pretty much it's like you ended by saying it puts all Californians at risk. This is no longer here's the employees I'm representing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
This is all. Yeah, this is.
I'm no longer speaking for the SEIU. Jesus, I'm no longer speaking for the SEIU UHW but for all Californians. The findings go on for A, B, C, D, all the way through Z, exactly Z. I'm not going to read all of them, but they start sort of just setting off there. It's an interesting read, to be sure. I mean, it establishes their worldview. Since the 1980s, here's W. Since the 1980s, the wealth of billionaires has grown by an average 7% each year, vastly outpacing the growth in wages and savings for ordinary Californians. The collective wealth of California billionaires has surged from $300 billion in 2011 to $700 billion in 2019 to over $2 trillion in 2025. The wealth tax imposed by this act would only modestly slow this explosive growth, collecting less than the billionaires typically gain in just a single year. So they talk about a tax reserve fund. So I guess whenever you do these sort of new revenue generations, they sort of allocate it to a separate fund. And they're going to split it 90% of kind of what's earned here is going to put into the Billionaire Tax Health Account. And that's specific for healthcare funding. And then the last 10% is going to go into the Billionaire Tax Education and Food Assistant account. All right. So one of the first things in chapter 1, the imposition of tax on personal wealth in excess of $1 billion in net worth. So this is 50301A. It says an excise tax is imposed for tax year 2026 on the activity of sustaining excessive accumulations of wealth by applicable individuals with net worth of $1 billion or more. The thing that stood out to me here is the excise tax part. The fact that they're framing it as like an excise tax. So in Massachusetts, where I'm from, we have a car excise tax, and that's justified by the fact, to help pay for roads and stuff, that if you have a car, that you should pay something to cover it. The other thing with excise taxes, sometimes they're called a sin tax because different tobacco, alcohol, gas, like gasoline, all has like a separate, it's not just a sales tax, it's like a per unit, just flat tax. The government is want to try to discourage the consumption of those things, right? So I thought it was really interesting to call a billionaire tax an excise tax as though just being a billionaire is a sin. They want to discourage you from being a billionaire. This is what it says. Every California resident individual is required to file, so either you declare that you're not a billionaire, or 2, submit a declaration of the amount of any additional tax that is owed under this part, together with any forms created by the Franchise Tax Board for calculating any additional tax owed under this part, along with any required appraisals or other evidence of fair market value. So, and then afterwards, they say the board shall examine all returns submitted in accordance with this part and shall determine the correct amount of the tax under this part. So a couple things here is you basically just got to lay out, your entire net worth. Everything is just going to be an open book to the tax authority. It's not like sort of where it is now where, we do the tax return, right?
Right.
We kind of know what we're worth and we know what we have to pay. And then the government kind of they kind of trust it, right? They can do audits. So there's obviously a threat of going to jail if you didn't fill out your tax return right. That's always a threat. But in this case, they're just shh, open the books. Let us see everything. Give me, show me the appraisal for XYZ and there's a gazillion other things you imagine that billionaires probably have. It's a huge overhead. And the thing is, they've already identified that there's only 200 billionaires and that they're going to look at every single one. The board shall examine all returns.
Yeah, it almost seems kind of predatory in a sense when you think about it that way. There's only this small group of people. We're going to be down everyone's throats.
The fact that this targets a small identifiable group with a substantial financial burden is arguably inflicting punishment without sort of a process. Sort of to your point. So that's sort of one of the avenues, if this ever gets that far, to why this would be unconstitutional. Let's zoom in on one of the most kind of contentious parts. There's a lot of words devoted to how to actually figure out how much somebody should pay. Here it is. For any interests that confer voting or other direct control rights, the percentage of the business entity owned by the taxpayer shall be presumed to be not less than the taxpayer percentage of the overall voting or other direct control rights. So this is the main objection point, because this like tax organization that sort of wrote up a little bit about this did an analysis. And one of the extreme cases is this guy, Tony Xu, the head of DoorDash. So he has his ownership stake, though you and I would think about it, would be 2.6%, but I guess his voting shares is 57%. And what this says, it says, okay, don't give me the value at the 2.6% number, give me the 57% number, right? That's what his tax liability is. Now, obviously, if you do that, then all of a sudden his tax liability is more than his net worth.
Like going through all these things, it just sounds like it's just a total gimmick. Like that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So this is the next one, D. For any profits, interests in a business entity, the percentage of the entity owned by the taxpayer shall be presumed to be not less than the maximum such percentage interest of the entity's profits the taxpayer may earn, without respect to whether such profits interest is subject to a condition precedent that has not yet been met. So that's a little convoluted. I had to read it a few times. My interpretation is that, like, if somebody has a stock option or something, like if you hit these milestones, right, then you would win XYZ. What this is saying is it has to assume that you've hit those, even if you haven't. So like the big thing that I thought it was like Musk. You know, Musk has like these really huge, you got to get like, 10x the, market value for Tesla or something. And then we will give you, a huge payout. If you don't make it, then we won't give you anything. This is kind of saying is we're going to, the percentage into the own is going to be presumed like, after you already hit those targets, which is also kind of nuts.
Like you said, you have to just open up everything you have, like constantly, pretty much.
Yeah, your entire like compensation package. On top of,
yeah.
I mean, you imagine
deals are being made, what falls through.
Like the accountants that would be going through each of these tax returns just would be like licking their lips, just like rubbing their hands, just like, like how much can we get? I mean, it's not 5%. Basically, at the end of the day, like they're playing with, okay, yeah, 5%, it's nothing. But then you start playing with that, that top number, 5% of not this, but this. This one, I really couldn't get my head around. This is E. So we've hit like a pretty strong string here, C, D, E. They say, the fair market value of those interests at the end of any tax year shall be presumed to be the sum of the book value of the business entity plus a present value multiplier of 7.5 times the annual book profits of the business entity, averaged over the last 2 years. And if it was negative, then it's 0. Multiplied by the percentage of the entity owned. So this is kind of crazy. They seem to be taking the book value, right, which is one valuation method, and they're adding a separate valuation method, like the price to earnings or something. They're saying 7.5 times profit, which is like a pretty modest, price multiplier and all that. But like, why are you adding those two together? Like, it's been a little while since I've taken corporate finance, admittedly, at SEPA, but I'm pretty sure that's not how you value a company, right? Like, what's going on here? Like, does this make any sense to you?
It just brings that word gimmick back to me. This almost doesn't even seem like it's being seriously written for something that's seriously going to go through. And like in that way, like what's the probability that the people that wrote this from the start, like, no, none of it's going to happen. They're just writing a document and throwing it out there in the world to,
I don't know,
achieve some sort of goal.
We'll get to, we can start theorizing a little bit about that too. Here's another one. Not too many more left. It says, in the case of a business entity, in no case shall the value of such entity be less than the valuation reflected in any funding round or other sale of equity according within 2 years of the valuation date, unless the taxpayer can show by clear and convincing evidence that such valuation would significantly overstate the value of the entity. So they're kind of taking the value of the company's high watermark over the last 2 years, and like that's the value, which is kind of BS. In case of any underpayment of tax attributable to a substantial or gross overstatement or understatement of valuation in a certified appraisal, the board may at its discretion impose a penalty on the appraiser as if such appraiser were, quote unquote, the taxpayer for purposes of sections 50312. Brutal. Here's one thing. The apportionment and credits, 100% of any tax imposed under the section is apportioned to California for all applicable individuals and applicable trusts. It says later that, they give some reasons for why there might be relief, like if you don't live there, or the actual physical thing that's being taxed, like wasn't in the state for a certain number of enough days. But they also provide a floor. So that says relief under the subdivision shall not reduce the apportionment percentage below 25%, unless like there's an Office of Tax Appeals and all that. So like this is another one where they're starting to talk about the unconstitutional aspect maybe of this. California just can't just like tax stuff from all over the country, for instance, and then claim it just for itself. Last thing I'll say is the other like unconstitutional argument had to do with like due process and the retroactivity of the bill, in the sense that this would like presumably be for 2026, even though it's not law yet. It's just like a proposition. And this is one of the reasons I think they even cited in the All In podcast as to why people were leaving when they were, because they knew this was like in the pipeline. And there's like this retroactive potential application of this thing. So it's like, just, you got to get out before January 1st, 2026, if this thing goes through. What I'll add is just, they say that this is definitely not going to go through because it's the other unions don't like it. SEIU, UHW did this by themselves. And you can kind of see that when he says like the proceeds are just going to go essentially like their own stuff, like, education and healthcare. Whereas the other unions, they want a little cut of the action. So they're going to be opposed to it until they can kind of broaden what the proceeds can be used for, right? Like a bunch of hyenas. You know what I mean? Like that's how it reads. And you got to see that in the bill and what they mean by that, which I didn't really understand before. I just thought it was like just went to the general fund. But the fact that you can have a bill and it's, earmarked for specific things definitely sort of complicates how this would work in sort of a sea of different unions.
Guess we'll see.
We'll see. All right. Well, anyway,
keep an eye on
that was
this.
interesting. This has been another episode of the Root of All Evil podcast. My name is Luke.
And I'm Joe.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
See you then.
Bye.